At some point, we're going to have to throw things away. We're going to have to dispose of old hard drives, old tapes, old documentation, old equipment, old disks. How do we deal with media disposal? And the IS auditor is particularly interested in media disposal because once we throw something away, it's out of our control. People could be dumpster diving or they can retrieve stuff. Some government agencies do not allow, like when they give away, they donate computers to charity or something, the hard drives can't be part of it. And you have to realize that it's not going to just be the hard drives, but firmware on motherboards and firmware on other things will give away basically the configuration of a system, and you might not want to give away that kind of information. There's also documentation, there's tapes, there's disks, there's hard drives, there's removable media. All these things we have to worry about. Let's talk about backups for one thing. When I make a backup, it's usually unencrypted, which means if someone grabs a copy of that backup, they can just restore it, and now they see all the data. How are you going to destroy old backups? Not only store them safely, but how are you going to get rid of them? How are you going to get rid of old tapes that are so worn out you don't dare use them anymore, or you don't want to use them anymore? We need to have a way of destroying those as well effectively. How about hard drives that are so old and yet they might contain information that is personally identifiable or confidential or secret or whatever? You can degauss, meaning you can put a hard drive on a basically a strong magnet to wipe it out, but the only truly secure way is to destroy the hard drive so that the data can't be recovered. Because a hard drive is basically a metal platter. It'll have like 2 or 3 little platters that spin on a spindle, and there are these little arms that read, that move across the surface of this platter. And even if you erase, there's going to be a magnetic imprint underneath, and with the right kind of equipment, even if you erase many times, you might still be able to retrieve the information. So at what point is it acceptable to just simply degauss or erase, or certainly just formatting isn't good enough, so that you don't have information leakage. So you have to consider all these things. You might have data that is not stored in a normal database that was backed up. You may have stacks of surveys, you may have paper data, you may have tapes or disks or something like that. You may have data that was the result of marketing campaigns and consumer surveys. And some of that will probably contain personal identifiable information or possibly confidential information, certainly consumer habits, which we're trying to protect with privacy awareness. So what are you going to do with those things? You're just going to throw them in the dumpster, or you're going to shred them, or what? See, in your security policy, there's got to be a disposal procedure. And there has to be a way of identifying what can just be tossed in the trash as opposed to what has to be shredded, as opposed to what has to be destroyed, as opposed to what can just simply be wiped out. And the IS auditor wants to see, were these procedures upheld, or are there any procedures in place? Is there a disposal policy? You might have situations also where the tape that this information is on is starting to get worn out, but by service level agreement, by regulation, by contract, by whatever reason, we need to keep this information, but the tapes are starting to get worn out, so we're going to transfer from one to another. Now, what do you do with the old one? How do you destroy that? So these are all things that you have to be aware of. There needs to be a policy in place for securely shredding or destroying stuff that is too confidential or too secret to just let out. And then how do you properly dispose of everything else? How do you properly transfer data when media starts to wear out? So the IS auditor needs to look at all of these things. There can be a number of triggers that will trigger when we will dispose of media. And we can see some examples over here. There's been a major technology change, including obsolescence. Nobody uses 8-track tapes. Nobody uses Betamax anymore. We went to VHS. Nobody uses 5 1/4-inch floppies anymore. Nobody uses floppies. And so, and pretty soon, I mean, nobody uses this or that or the other. So it's time to move the data from one type of media to another. I mean, if you are trying to preserve something archivally, you may also in your archives say, you know what, we've got these tapes and they only run on certain kinds of tape drives. We're going to have to move this to another kind of storage media because we want to keep the archive of it, but we have no way of replaying this thing. So obsolescence, technology change could be one reason. Or you may have a regulatory or compliance requirement that will require us to shred or move or restore something. Or the client wants to use a different vendor or a different version or a different technology. Now to comply with what the client wants, we need to take it off of tape and put it onto USB or a drive or something. Or just the asset, the tape or whatever, is just naturally expiring, or these drives are naturally expiring, or the media is naturally expiring. I remember when compact disc first came out, and it was originally thought that the usable life of those things would be maybe about 10 years. We know that they have lasted longer than that. But then there have also been cases where we have lots of stuff on tape, and either we don't have the means to play those tapes back, or the tape itself, we're worried about the tape itself starting to deteriorate. So any of these things could trigger the need for moving information off and destroying the old media. So the IS auditor, when looking at the disposal process, wants to be looking at this checklist here. Did the disposal process address all of the separate goals of the disposal policy? And when we did the review, were all of the separate goals addressed? Did the disposal guidelines, were they published? Were they available? Did people know how to dispose of certain things? Were the guidelines, did they specify the proper time period for when we should dispose of things and how long a document should live? Did the policy specify which documents can be discarded as opposed to which documents have got to be shredded? Did we comply with any regulatory requirements saying you've got to keep this thing for 2 years or 7 years? You got to realize that putting stuff in the recycle bin isn't any more safe than throwing paper in a trash can. You know, the recycle bin, we can go right into it. Even if you permanently delete something, we can still retrieve data off of drives. If we hire a third-party vendor to safely dispose of our stuff, if they don't do their job, we're still responsible, because ultimately it was our job to get rid of this stuff safely. The fact that we outsourced it to someone doesn't mean we can outsource the responsibility. Now we may have a contract that helps share in the responsibility, but we're the ones who are going to get in trouble. And if we're going to reuse storage media like USB drives, did we thoroughly wipe that stuff clean? Is it considered acceptable now? Or if we're going to reuse hard drives, was it thoroughly wiped clean? Or if we're going to just give them away, dispose of them, did we thoroughly wipe them clean? And then are there any additional government standards that are being met for our particular organization, our business, or our particular location? And with that, that is the end of all of the topics for Lesson 4.